What I could do right now is provide you with a very simplistic answer, like a lot of personal trainers would, but that's not what we're going to do here. There is absolutely nothing more satisfying in the gym than hitting a big But although it looks really cool, is it really necessary to advance our lifting? Some will swear by heavy lifting as the best thing since sliced bread, and others actually aren't afraid to break the status quo. Who's right? Is it a matter of common sense that lifting heavier is obviously better, or does it require more analysis? I think you know the answer to that question. Now it's time to answer the real question, and we need to answer it now, because you're here to get healthy. We all are. Right, so before we get into a discussion of actual effectiveness, we have to understand people lift weights for a lot of reasons, be it athleticism, basic physical health, strength, size, or riz. However, for our purposes, we'll focus on strength and hypertrophy. Theoretically, the bigger your muscle, the stronger you are because of cross-sectional area, which essentially describes the size of the muscle if it was cut. A greater cross-sectional area indicates greater overall fiber volume, which means a higher potential for strength. However, what is not necessarily true is causating strength with size. See, strength has many factors, like cross-sectional area, which we mentioned, but also neuromuscular efficiency and overall health and condition of your muscles. It is primarily trained by simply challenging your existing force production capacity. Size is a bit different, as it not only encapsulates a challenge in force production, but also requires a sufficient amount of time under tension in order to stimulate this growth and really get the most out of this challenge. This is why more strength won't always mean more size, because there are two components to it. The difficulty for most people to absorb is how exactly we measure strength. Because I mentioned a challenge in force production capacity, but there are many ways to do that. Lifting a water bottle for hours will challenge my force production, but it doesn't necessarily indicate I'm challenging my shoulder strength levels. Whereas bench pressing solid weight does indicate that I'm testing my chest strength levels. What gives? Well, in most scientific literature you'll see, it's measured in terms of capacity, or to use scientific jargon, 1 rep maxes. It's pretty straightforward, with a 1 rep max being the highest weight possible that you can perform a good technique rep at, and the measure of strength that we will use, as it measures a raw ability to produce force. In the water bottle example, while it became harder to produce force over time, the amount of force wasn't substantial. So you can envision how both strength and size are important. Alright, so that was a pretty brief standardization, and not much needed to be analyzed in terms of numbers. But it also didn't answer our question of whether lifting big actually gets us big. Sometime back in 2017, a meta-analysis was performed by the very trusty Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, who compared load size to gains in both strength and hypertrophy. The study itself scored 5.6 on the Pedro scale, indicating excellent quality, and the conditions of the study were as follows. They defined high versus low load as being above or below 60% of 1 rep max, respectively. All sets were, thankfully, performed to muscular failure. This allowed the researchers to control for the intensity and isolate the intended measures, which are only the amount of load being handled. All studies which were part of the review were done over at least a 6-week period, and all participants were physically fit with no real medical history. And what they found was quite expected and very relevant. When measuring 1 rep maxes, there was a significant difference between using high loads and lower loads. However, when measuring hypertrophy, there actually was no significant difference. Even though the effect size was a bit higher for higher loads, we can't say that higher loads are conclusively better, even though these results say that yes, they may give you marginally more gains. So, how do we get bigger if higher loads or lower loads don't provide anything conclusive? What I could do right now is provide you with a very simplistic answer, like a lot of personal trainers would, but that's not what we're going to do here. Instead, I'm going to provide a representation of the signaling pathway behind muscle growth, and then transition into why the study results make sense. First up, hypertrophy. If I were to lift weights, pure mechanical stress and tension release a molecule known as IGF-1, and muscle cells actually have receptors to accommodate this particular molecule. The stimulation activates a molecule known as PI3K, which phosphorylates another molecule, AKT. Now this activation is crucial because AKT goes on to activate mTOR, which you may have heard of, because mTOR, after some more signaling cascades, promotes protein synthesis. Okay, that was a lot of science, but keep all that in your head. Don't forget about it because we're about to contrast it with what we previously learned about strength. Recall that when we were discussing strength, we were talking about testing your existing force production capacity, which will give you the ultimate boost in the 1 rep max. With hypertrophy though, what we found was that we need sufficient mechanical tension coupled with muscular-based failure, or at least very close to it. So what does this exactly mean? Well, it means that as long as we utilize good form, going through a full range of motion and keeping all of our sets intense, then hypertrophy will naturally be stimulated. It differs because it doesn't require us to choose a weight that is extremely difficult to move in order to stimulate gains, but rather a weight that is somewhat challenging so that our muscles can actually fail. However, we can't yet refute our hypothesis that we need to lift big to get big. It still holds some validity, and a lot more than you may think. The golden rule of the body is that it does everything for survival. In fact, did you know that 20% of our total energy is consumed by our brain all by itself? It's not because the brain's selfish, it's because the body knows the capacity of what must be done by the brain. So, applying the same principles to muscle building, we have to force our bodies to grow muscle, meaning there has to be a challenge in force production in order to grow. Note, not a challenge in the amount being produced itself, but just a challenge in the production. It may seem confusing, but this is where the special sauce, reps, come into play. But you don't want to see yourself doing nearly 45 to 50 reps per set, because at that point, you didn't fail due to muscular insufficiency, even though it may feel that way. You failed due to cardio. I'd recommend using about 55 to 85% of your 1 rep max for general hypertrophy training. But why so broad of a range? Well, it's because hypertrophy training can span a lot of reps, just not too much. So what's the bottom line here? Yes, you do need to lift difficult weight to get bigger. However, the weight doesn't have to be so difficult that you're failing within 5 reps, or even worse, consistently breaking form. Keep the intensity up, get the fundamentals down, and enjoy the fruits of moving some pretty heavy weight.